Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm your host, Rafe Kelley. At Evolve, Move, Play, our aim is to help you cultivate a more meaningful life and a more heroic self by reconnecting deeply to movement, mindfulness, nature, and community practices. This podcast was created to bring the best and brightest minds in all of these subjects together to better understand how we can create an empowering and sustainable ecology of practices for personal growth. If you're interested in being part of this ongoing conversation, the best way you can support us and get involved is by joining our Podcast Plus membership. By joining, you will get backstage access to our live podcast airing once a month, as well as a private question and answer session with me and our guests after the show. On top of that, you'll get access to our thriving online community where you can continue these deeper discussions with people all over the world who are just as passionate and curious about these topics as you. More details about the membership, as well as the link to get signed up, are in the description below. And whether you can join, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so that you can be notified every Monday when our episodes drop. Thanks so much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. This week, my guest is Jan Bloem. Jan Bloem is a martial arts instructor who specializes in Systema, but also has a deep karate background and studied Pentjak Silat and a number of different martial arts. He has a really fascinating perspective on martial arts. He's someone who's been highly recommended to me by a number of people in the community for a long time. He understands the role of play. He thinks from an ancestral perspective, and thinks, in a lot of ways that are parallel to my own thinking. Of course, we differ a little bit on our perspective on Systema in particular, which is a fun tension and something that we get to explore on the podcast. So if you're interested in martial arts, interested in how movement arts impact life in a more general sense, I think you'll really enjoy my conversation with Jan. Without further ado, Jan Bloem. Jan, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
So tell me a little bit about your background. You were recommended to me to speak to. I know you have a background in a variety of martial arts, and also you have a science background as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the science and the different martial and movement arts that you've dug into?
Well, next week I become 50, and my journey into martial arts started when I was 4. So it's 46 years.
Yeah.
And that's because I was bullied quite a lot, and my parents were not able to find any help. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, you go to a psychologist and stuff like that, but in that time, you had to find it out yourself. And then a friend of mine from school, every Tuesday evening, he went to this gym with a white suit on, and something told me that I have to follow that. And I was looking through the window and I saw all kind of people throwing each other, and it was Judo.
Okay.
So I begged my parents to bring me there, which they finally did. And my biggest victory was 6 months after I started Judo, that the guy in the neighborhood who always bullied me, I threw him in the bushes with a shoulder throw like that.
Wow, nice.
But then he had a brother, and Judo was not helping against that amount of flesh. And then in '84, I saw the Karate Kid movie, mm-hmm. and I thought, well, that's what I need to learn. And not only because of that kick, that specific crane kick, mm-hmm. but I also liked Mr. Miyagi.
Yeah.
So I was looking for the secret technique and Mr. Miyagi, and I was lucky enough to find a teacher who always emphasized cross training. So go wrestling, if you want to improve your kicks, go to Taekwondo. If you want to improve your boxing, you have to go to boxing. So we always did a lot of different things. So that started a journey into Aikido, Pentjak Silat, which I still practice, by the way, my son now also. And then when I was 15, 16, my teacher came up to me and said, Jan, I want to quit teaching martial arts because fitness is financially more interesting. So if you want to continue, you have to do it yourself. So I did, but I didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And so I got very interested in the behavior I saw with the kids studying.
So you were 13 when you saw
the Karate Kid, based on your age. So then you had basically 2 years, 3 years, and
about 3 years.
That was karate. Was that I heard?
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast and you're saying was that Goju-ryu or Shotokan?
No, in that time it was Shotokan.
Okay.
Mixed with Kyokushin. So we fought full contact, but we did a kata of Shotokan.
Okay.
That was in the Netherlands, that's usual to train like that.
Shotokan, kata, Kyokushin.
Yeah. Knockdown. Yeah. Dutch people like to rough and rumble a lot from hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. But what struck me was, a lot of, although I was 16, 17, parents came up to me with their children asking me for educational advice. Mm-hmm. What can I do with my kid who's too aggressive? What can I do with my kid who is not aggressive enough? And I witnessed something happening on the mat. The children changed. So the boy too aggressive became less aggressive. The girl not aggressive enough became more aggressive, so to say, or assertive, how you want to call it.
Yeah.
And then I was on the point, I should go and study medicine, which I did for 2 years, but I didn't get the answers I needed. So then I switched to human movement science and educational psychology. And in the end, that gave me the answers to the questions I had. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, I went to Amsterdam to study what we call integrative movement therapy, which is a method. I think in the United States, you would call it body-oriented psychotherapy, something like that.
Sorry, what?
Body-oriented psychotherapy.
Body-oriented psychotherapy. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that from like Wilhelm Reich, or where does that? What's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Stronger. My professor Hilarion Petzold from Germany. He studied with Fritz Perls and Merleau-Ponty and all, big names like that. So I was very lucky to find him. I still work with him. He's 80, around 80 now. Still loves martial arts, and he also involves martial arts a lot in his practice. So that's nice. But that's my scientific background, and from there I got involved with police because they liked the combination of my fighting ability, but also my theoretical background. Yeah. I could also explain why you should train in a different way. And from that assignment I got from the Dutch Police Academy, which brought me to Israel to study Krav Maga, I studied a lot of so-called reality-based self-defense method, because the Dutch police wanted to know how should we train police officers if we want them to behave professional in a highly stressful situation. And in the end, that brought me to Russia. So I went to Russia. I met a lot of now big names, which were training in that time all together. So Talanov, Borshov, Ryabkov, Vasiliev, all the big guys, they just train together. Now they have their own schools. Yeah, and then I got, that was 2001, I believe. And that got me very into the question, how can we achieve a maximal result with minimal effort? Is what the internal martial arts are stating, is that actually true? Can we achieve that when we have to fight someone who doesn't know us, who just wants to rip our head off? And can we win or submit a guy like that without stepping into the same trap of, using a lot of physical strength and stuff like that? Mm-hmm. And well, it still keeps me busy.
Yeah. So I was listening to another podcast with you, and they're saying you also have a background in Goju-ryu, which you mentioned. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was when I started university, I met a friend who's still my friend, Eric, and he studied Goju-ryu, and he that I also like martial arts. He said, "Oh, come with me because I train also karate." But I came there. I said, "But strange style, you know, they move totally different." But I liked the way they fought, because in Goju-ryu, especially the IOGKF of Higona, they use irikumi, which uses a lot of infighting and grappling stuff. So it's rather complete. And I really loved that. And I got more and more interested in also the background, in the kata, to move in a totally different way. And then in between, I studied with Jean Frenet. Maybe you know him. He was the Canadian Tornado in the 90s. He was world famous. He could kick 180 up.
Oh yeah.
And he did this musical forms. He was also the karate teacher in Police Academy 3.
Okay.
Stuff like that was not of my interest, but I also liked kicking. So I was a student of him a couple of times, and he also switched to Goju. So that two things made me switch to Goju-ryu, and which in my case is still one of the most phenomenal karate styles there is. Mm-hmm. Because of the, with the breathing and stuff like that. A lot of karate styles talk about it, but they are not able to really explain to you how to do it. And then
so, I mean, I'm not an expert on karate. I studied Tang Judo when I was a small child.
That's Korean karate,
yeah. Tang Judo is just literally, my understanding is that it's a translation of the kanji from Japanese into Korean. It's literally means karate, just in Korean. So I started Tang Judo, but only for a year when I was, say, 6 years old. Though it's funny, I feel like I can kind of drop into the stances and the structure of the movement pretty easily. But then, I would go on to, really most of my martial arts background is Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, sort of classic MMA stuff. I have done a bit of Russian martial arts. I trained with some of Scott Sonnen's students Scott here in Bellingham. And then later we had a Russian Systema teacher through the parkour gym that I worked at, and I took a few classes with him. So I picked up some of the concepts and seen some of the movement. But that's my primary background. So tell me a little bit about what was the difference you saw between Shotokan, Kyokushin, and Goju-ryu, and then Systema, and why is Goju-ryu the one that really stuck with you?
I'm just last Sunday, I started teaching the national instructors course for karate teacher in the Netherlands. When you want to become a martial arts instructor, you need to do a national course. And I'm one of the teachers at that course. And I made a joke that the only depth there is in Shotokan is the depth of their stances. And some like the joke, most of them don't. But I still remember that I was first or second dan. I'm a fifth dan now into Shotokan. That the Kase sensei, which was one of the first Japanese coming to Europe to teach Shotokan, he changed the stances. So if you have this bow and arrow stance, and that's Senkutsu Dats, they call it.
We can't quite see your hands. If you want us to see your hands, there we go.
Oh yeah. So it's the bow and arrow stance, they call it. So you have, I think 70% of your weight is in the front leg, and your rear leg is stretched. It's classical basic stance of. But Kase saw that most of the white European people were having really long legs, and in kata it wasn't looking very well. So what he did was to make us bend the rear leg. Okay. A kind of horse stance combined with a bow and arrow stance. Sure. That's more or less what it is. But I was wondering how you could use your hip then, because until that moment, you have to twist your hip. But in that stance, you can't. So I asked my teacher, but how can I use my hip? How can I use my tanden and my tanchen to support? Stay after class. So I did, and I thought, well, finally I get some answers. But that ended up, we trained from 7 p.m. until 9 p.m. I had to travel for 2.5 hours to go to this training, then 2 hours training. And then he said, stay. I had to go from 9 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. only doing this Kion, this basic training, walking that side, walking backward. And then he said, do you understand? I said, no. He said, go back home. I never got the answer until I had my first acquaintance with Goju Ryu, and the teacher did something which they call tanden ski. So you make a punch without twisting your hips, and you had to, instead of the circle horizontal, you had to make a vertical circle in biomechanically.
Oh,
but it's a yellow belt technique. When you're a beginner, you already learned that. And in Shotokan at the 5th dan level, I never heard that they did it.
Interesting.
And that's for me the difference between, I think, Okinawan karate in general, but specifically Goju Ryu, White Shiryu, so that really Chinese-oriented styles. They have much more depth theoretically, but also biomechanically. They are much more interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, from like an MMA perspective, Shotokan is something that pops right to mind when we think of karate that kind of works because of Ryo Machida and Shinzo Machida, right?
Yeah.
Because it seems like until quite recently, Shotokan kept a very alive kumite style, sparring style that allowed them to actually have I mean, Machida, when he came into the MMA, like, he brought a skill set that was really interesting in the way that he was able to manipulate distance and be evasive that very few people in MMA were able to do. So Shotokan's always been kind of interesting to me because of that. I can't think of anyone who's coming through Goju Ryu. I think like GSP and GSP was Kyokushin, right? I think. And then I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think nowadays, especially with the modern karate athletes, the style doesn't say anything. Yes. So maybe they started with Shotokan, but when you look at the Olympic karate competition level, they all fight in the same way. Mm-hmm. And so style on that level is not saying anything. And also with this guys, they use the techniques of the my eye, so the distancing and stuff like that, which you also see in Olympic karate. Mm-hmm. The only difference is, and that's the same thing I always say with the MMA guy who's challenging all this Ki master and stuff like that. I say, yeah, come on, that's comparing apples with pears. The Tai Chi master, they never train in such a way. But if you train karate techniques like these guys are doing, and you train them in a UFC MMA style, well, then it can be a very interesting addition.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting about MMA to me is that basically the karate stance, or a karate-like stance, ends up being optimal in an MMA situation. So the best athletes come from wrestling generally.
Yeah.
And then you have, most of the best striking technique is derived from Muay Thai.
Yeah.
But almost nobody adopts a Muay Thai stance in MMA because you can't resist wrestling.
No.
So the distancing and the set of techniques that are available have almost universally, I mean, not completely. There's different metas. But the best strikers tend to have a longer stance than you're ever going to see in Muay Thai. Yeah. And they tend to have lower hands.
Yeah.
Right? And you tend to see that a lot of the best strikers, like Conor McGregor, Davison Figueiredo, they use a long lead hand.
Yeah.
Right? So the lead hand isn't tight like a boxer, right? It's not, sort of here like a Muay Thai fighter. It's kind of there.
Yeah.
And that seems to be adaptive to the type of distance that you're going to be fighting at when you're worried about kicks and takedowns, and when you're going to have to be able to get your hands down for down blocks if somebody's going to have to take you down.
Yeah, And that's the interesting thing about in the 70s and 80s, we had in the Netherlands, we had a competition which was called All Style. So all the different styles fighting each other. And in the first years, you really could see, oh, that's Pentjak Silat, or that's Taekwondo. And they were all fighting in their own specific way. But after 10 years, they all adapted the most effective techniques from each other. And there was a new kind of style born, a competitive style.
Yeah.
But it wasn't Pentjak Silat anymore. It wasn't Taekwondo anymore. But everyone fought in that way because it was the most effective way to fight in that specific way in this competition. And I think that's also what we see now in MMA. It's becoming more MMA in itself, like CrossFit in the early days. It was a competitive format. It wasn't a training method. It was a competitive format, and MMA also. But now it is a martial art in itself.
Yeah, it's growing that way. But
yeah,
it's interesting because you keep getting sort of influence from the different specialists, right? Like someone like Machida will come in and show how evasion and manipulation of distance can be used, right? Or someone like John Jones, who just has a really unique set of physical gifts, can do things that nobody else does, and something like the oblique kick becomes a major part of the meta.
But the big challenge is in the time I was a national trainer for the national karate team, and I always say, if you want to be a champion, you have to be a trendsetter, not a trend follower.
Mm-hmm.
And because the thing is that you mentioned now a couple of guys who have a very specific, very unique talent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the trap which might arise is that we try to imitate them. But it works for them because of their physical, because of their mental abilities, and it might not work for us. So the big challenge is to find your own set of skills and make it work for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, if you look at Machida versus Jones, I think Jones's game is much more based on his attributes, right? Mm-hmm. He probably averages like an 8-inch reach advantage against his opponents. So he's able to control distance in a different way by using, his posts and he can do a spinning elbow and have it land at what would be a normal hook range for somebody else.
Yeah.
But I think Jones found affordances in the game that nobody else has available to them because they're unique to his physical abilities, right?
Yeah.
If you're not 6'4" with an 84-inch reach and have the genetics of somebody who all of his brothers play in the NFL, then like his meta isn't necessarily one you want to adopt.
No, exactly. Yeah.
And, Machida, I think there's some of that because I think that like all the training he did in Shotokan and having kind of one hit, one kill as the sort of meta that he's training for, attuned him to moving in and out faster than most MMA athletes are going to feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
But the way that he manipulated distance, feinting, and, exposing that a lot of athletes were actually very open to attacks from the legs on the sort of the sagittal line there. That's something that a lot of people were able to adopt, right? It just, there was a belief in MMA that front kicks didn't work, and it was just incorrect. And he just exposed the flaw there. That was something that anybody could pick up.
Yeah, well, until this point, no one was able to use the front kick in an effective way. That might also be a conclusion.
Yeah.
Until this guy comes up and he is able to do it.
Yeah.
So, I think you have to be very careful with that kind of assumptions as an athlete. Oh, this is not working. Yeah, because you never met someone who was actually able to do it. If most of the top athletes are mainly grappling oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And at once there is this guy able to do this kind of kicks, and then it shows that it's not that a technique is not suitable, but you have to be able to execute it in the how do you say it, in the correct way.
Yeah.
So it's the person. It's not a style or the person needs to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's the person. It's the agent and the arena, right? It's the dynamic between the athletes and the situation, right?
Yeah.
So we'll get more into that in a little bit, but let's go back for a second. So you had this karate background and judo, and then you found Systema. So what was it that made you sort of? I mean, that's what I think you're most well known for, and the art that you've devoted most of your time to, if I'm correct. So
I always stay. Karate is well. I think the last 10 years I didn't wear a white suit anymore. Pentjak Silat is still something I practice twice a week. And Systema since 2001. My first exposure was with the Ratunski of the Ross, who's also the teacher of Scott Sonne, mm-hmm. which makes a kind of blend between Sambo and something else. Okay. And then, of course, Vasiliev came with his TRS videos and stuff like that. And
for the audience who's not familiar, Vladimir Vasiliev is probably the most well-known instructor in Systema. I mean, Mikhail Rybakov or...
Yeah, I think Vasiliev and Ryabko are the most well-known. But it's like a bit like in karate, the father of modern karate is Chijin Funakoshi, but the fact that they are most well known is not to say that they are the best out there. Yeah. And so there are a lot of interesting teachers in Russia and also outside of Russia, by the way.
Yeah.
But credits to them to bring this unique system to the world. And that's that's the thing. I was very much interested in the question: how can we have a maximal result with minimal effort? And I studied a lot of internal martial arts, like Tai Chi. I studied Bagua, Aikido, Liu He Bafa, all the internal styles. And I never found someone who is actually able to fight in that way in a real fight. So when the gloves get on and pick the mouthpiece and say, okay, let's go, they fought as aggressive as I did.
Yeah.
And that was not what I was looking for. And then I saw that Russian guys say, hey, that might be interesting. So I went there. I went to Toronto to train with Vasiliev. And afterwards, I mainly trained in Russia, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Tver, which is south of Moscow. And the thing I find unique in Systema is not so much the technical approach, but the didactical, the educational approach. Mm-hmm. In that sense, I never believed that there is one way of doing a technique which works for everyone.
Sure.
And in Systema, especially in how the Russians train it themselves, that's their basic assumption. You need to make it work for you. But there are certain principles. If you want to destroy someone's balance, you have to do certain things. How you do it, it's up to you. Instead of teaching technique after technique after technique, and you are able to execute a technique, but you don't know why it works, for example, and how you can adapt it to your own physical abilities. That was one part which attracted me to Systema, and the second part was their emphasis on dealing with emotions. And I also you always were told to keep your mouth shut, and if you had pain, you didn't show it to your opponent. But how you actually could train that was never an issue until I came to Russia. And well, they are really able to inflict a lot of pain. If they are not able to do it with their hands, they do it with sticks, chains, whips. But it's not like a kind of body conditioning. They really try to help you how to deal with that. well, the most familiar technique they use for that is the breathing technique. Mm-hmm. But it's in fact a mind fuck what they are doing, because the only thing you do mentally is to focus on a different thing instead of the pain. It's not a breathing itself. And of course, the stress element, which struck me also, because at the time I came back from Russia, and my mother-in-law, she remarried with a French guy, and he was involved with a L'Oreal. I don't know if you know this brand, L'Oreal. They make shampoos and stuff like that. And he was a kind of advisor for the management. And they had a problem that a lot of people in the higher management were sick, a lot of stress-related illnesses. So they decided to go to Thailand, to go to Chiang Mai, to this Dao resort of Mantak Chai to relax. And they had yoga, they had meditation, they had massage, they had a special diet, breathing exercises. And after 3 weeks, they came back totally relaxed, until one of the team lost the suitcases at the airport at Bangkok International. And within 10 minutes, the whole effect of 3 weeks of relaxation was completely gone in the whole team. So my father-in-law asked me if I could explain to him what was going on. And then directly the Systema methodology came to mind. I said, well, they use the Chinese way. And what I mean with that is, in China, they use this Qigong and meditation and stuff. And you sit on a pillow, or you lie down with a blanket, and it's all safe. But the thing is, if you want to learn how to relax or deal with stress in an effective way in a certain situation, you have to train it in a certain situation. Mm-hmm. And you have to make the gap between the training and reality as small as possible. And the Russians are very effective in that. So they teach you the basic breathing techniques, but then they throw you into physical exercises, physical challenges, which become more and more difficult. But the only thing you have to do is to keep up with the physical challenges and watch your breathing. Keep breathing, keep breathing, keep breathing. Which is, of course, less space between training and reality than when you train it slow and relaxed. Yeah. So you actually learn. In Russia, they try to teach you how to relax under physical stress in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that pragmatic approach was very appealing to me.
Yeah. Nice. It's interesting. So, like I said, I spent some time with a couple of Scott Sonnen students, Dan Kamisha and Doug Zolik, and then I spent some time with the Seattle Systema community. But Systema has quite a bad reputation in the May world, right? Because there's all these videos of people doing stuff that just really right. Yeah. It's the most. You see this in tons of traditional martial arts. I call it abusing the UK relationship, right? When you have a compliant stooge in front of you, then you can look like some kind of god of combat, right?
Yeah.
And so I always tell people that my experience of Russian martial arts is that it's really brilliant as a overall body cultivation practice.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff with the breath, a lot of stuff with the body relaxation. The fact that actually elements of parkour are addressed in Systema that you don't see addressed anywhere else. Like, one of my big complaints about the self-defense world is everybody talks about run away.
Yeah, but they don't.
They can't run.
No.
They're all overweight, wearing cargo pants, smoking cigarettes outside. And they have no idea about time to contact, how do you recognize egress, ingress, right? How do you there's so many things that actually go into being able to escape, right? You tell a small woman to just escape. It's well, maybe she's just not as fast as the man who's chasing her, right?
For example, yeah.
So being more strategic than just running becomes really important. But that's something I like about Systema, is that at least moving over obstacles is addressed.
Yeah.
But as far as the actual aspect of being able to fight, my experience of Systema-based fighters is that most of them are not particularly competent in hand-to-hand combat. They're really great at taking pain, and they hit really hard.
Yeah.
But they throw very round strikes that are very highly telegraphed, that are easy to see, and they can't respond. They don't have effective guards to deal with classic boxing straight strikes or good Muay Thai based kicks. They're just, all the weird kick somebody, slap someone with your foot behind the knee when they throw a kick at you that you see in the videos. Like, none of that works.
No.
So yeah, so I think it's interesting that, to me, I think there's some really good things to extract from that, but also, like, I'm very concerned about a culture that puts out so much footage of compliant stooge behavior with the idea that these masters have some sort of mystical powers.
Yeah, and the biggest problem is more and more they came to believe it themselves. Mm. And when I first met Mikhail Ryabko, he was really able to fight. Mm-hmm. I'm not the best fighter in the world, but I can manage pretty well. And I tried. It was with Val Ryazanov, which is also a real solid fighter. And he saw it was in London the first time I met Ryabko, and
when was this?
Saw in my what, sir?
When was this? Like what time?
I think 2003, something like that. It was the first time he came to London. Martin Wheeler was also there. Mm-hmm. And Ryazanov saw in my face, well, you don't believe it, eh? I said, no, the fat guy, he is moving his arm like that and a foot like that. You're able to see it, but you don't. So when you're in front of him, he moves in such a way. He is not pulling punches. So there is no movement before movement. And that's what I found very, very interesting. And so he has a way of controlling his movement in such a way that it goes beyond visual detection.
Sure.
There is a guy in Germany, Helmut Bartel, he moves in the same way. And it's really true. I don't make it up. Helmut Bartel, he is even more fat than Ryabko. He teaches always outside. He every Friday for 2 years. Every Friday I went up to the Danish border. I live close to the German border, but it's 3 hours drive to the Danish border. He lives there in a small village. Whether it was 30 degrees Celsius outside or it was freezing, he was always sitting on his chair outside. And on a moment he said to me, you don't believe me, eh? I said, no, really, no. He said, hit me. And he was sitting on his chair. He said, hit me. So I did it in the Systema way, the slow. And I thought, oh, I know this game. He said, no, hit me. Mm. I said, you mean for real? He said, yeah. I said, okay. Then I do it. And I really saw him sitting on a chair. And when I fell over the chair and I stood up and I saw him laughing. I said, how the hell did you do that? A thick guy, 3 heart attacks. What is going on? And then he explained, and it's a very simple exercise. If you place your thumb in front of you and you look really intensely to your thumb and you very quickly turn your head, then from in this 90-degree angle, you still see the thumb. Mm-hmm. It's still on your visual cortex. He said, that's the principle I work with. But you have to move in a different way. And he calls it inner boxing, so inner boxing. So instead of what karate is doing, with it hikite, so pulling your fist back and then punch, he does the same. But he explained it to me if you have your hand like this, and you put your fingers like that, then the goal is to stretch your fingers. So at first I did this. He said, no, your fingertips are not allowed to cross this line. So this is not allowed. So you have to find a different way to stretch your fingers. But what's happening then, if you stretch your fingers, you feel the movement going towards your body instead of out. He said, try that. And well, it's a very complicated way, but that's also what I felt with Ryabko. They control their body movement in a different way, which makes them really effective fighters. But at some point, Ryabko went totally into religion and called his style Poznaj Serbia, to know yourself. And yeah, for me, I call it Aikido 2.0, you know. I lost track there. And you know, one of the things we did was this non-physical work, which is one of the videos which receives the most critics, of course, on YouTube. It is non-physical stuff. But the Ryabko before always told me, he said, but it's not about fighting. Vel Ryazanov once said, he said, yes, when someone has a good sense, he feels you're a good fight, he moves away. If he not move away, you have to hit his heart, you have to hit his head like a rock. and then Ryabko always said, like, okay, but this non-physical work is an interaction between teacher and student with the goal to increase your sensitivity. So you become more sensitive for the intention of the other one. He said, that's the only goal there is. I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. But now it's like all the Chinese Tai Chi master, he points like that and people feel angry, and he points like that and people feel sad. And if he touches here, they need to go to the toilet. And yeah, again, I lost track there. But before, he was much more rational. And he was never a good explainer. I learned most from Ryabko with actually one-on-one fighting with him.
Yeah.
And which I think is still the best way to teach someone, but especially when you want to teach them how to fight. But yeah, again, somewhere it became Aikido, Tai Chi 2.0, and the worst thing is that they start to believe it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, if you got people who, I think that people don't take seriously enough in the martial arts the idea that that adversarial relationships are very different from student-teacher relationships.
Yeah,
and that the students are viewing themselves in a hierarchical relationship to the teacher, and they're actually they're emotionally invested in the idea that the teacher has something of value.
Yeah.
And so they will sacrifice themselves in certain ways, often subconsciously, in order to maintain the frame. Once they've invested in that teacher, to maintain the frame that the teacher is of transcendent value. And that can just run away in bizarre ways in the martial arts, which is why I think, you know, I tend to think that, you know, I've read a fair bit of reality-based self-defense stuff, and I've encountered people from most different martial arts throughout my movement training career. And I really come down to the fact that, like, I believe that sport fighters are the people who have the best preparation to fight. I also think that they frequently fail to realize the things that aren't going to transfer. I mean, for a very simple thing, I know lots of guys who don't have well-conditioned fists, who hit really hard in gloves, you know, with their hands wrapped, and don't realize that, like, okay, they're probably going to break their hand if they throw that hook in the street. And it's just forgotten. It's like, we're just training for that. You end up just training for the sport, right? And you're like, oh yeah, we can fight because we are fighting. But it's like, well, yeah, but you're fighting in a very specific context.
Yep.
But I don't think that people get to the ability to fight without some kind of very alive situation. And I think as soon as you focus on all the safety flaws of the games that you can play and focus on all the things you can't do there, you lose the delivery system, as my friend Matt Thorin calls it. You have to have a delivery system. You have to have something, judo, boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai. That's your delivery system. And then you go and try to fill in the gaps and understand the context. And, like 90% of self-defense has nothing to do with fisticuffs anyways. All right.
No, and when I look here in the Netherlands, we had in the 70s, 80s, we had this feminist group who started self-defense for girls and women.
Yeah.
But if you look at the program, they teach girls and women very masculine techniques. Mm-hmm. And even now, one of my students, he works at a university, he did a study which showed that blunt force trauma is biomechanically impossible for women. So to cause blunt force trauma in an attacker is biomechanically almost impossible for a woman.
Well, I mean, I think you have to caveat that, because we can all go watch women's MMA and see lots of women causing blunt force trauma to each other.
Yeah. But if you are 100 kilograms and a girl is 50, that's different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think people really misunderstand this. And I think that women's MMA is almost to some degree misleading, because it's weird, because like in basketball, you can see how big the gap is between male and female skill, because there's an objective metric outside of the two athletes moving, which is the hoop, right? So you can see how high they are relative to the hoop all the time.
Yeah.
But we're not very good. It seems to me that people are not very good at objectively seeing speed. We only recognize speed relationally. We can see that this guy is faster than that guy. Yeah. This guy's more powerful than that guy. So when you see a dyad of two female athletes and they're highly skilled, it doesn't look that different from two highly skilled male athletes.
No.
You have to actually tangle with a number of different male and female athletes to really recognize it. We have to think about the structural physics of it. Like I'm 100 kilos, my wife's, probably half my size when you look at lean body mass, right?
Yeah.
And her hand is so much smaller than mine.
Yeah.
Like if she closes a fist and swings it as hard as she can at my head, like it's just really unlikely that that's going to result in a good result for her as opposed to me. I mean, even me with a big fat hand, throwing your fist at somebody's skull is always a dangerous game.
Yeah.
But especially when your hand is smaller, and on average, women's hands are proportionally much more graceful than men's hands. Mm-hmm. And there's so much less upper body mass to swing and accelerate and get structure behind that strike.
Yeah. That's exactly what the study also showed, and the context was self-defense, so not combative sports. And I think even then, if I've also a female student, if she hits me, I really feel it. Mm-hmm. But that's exceptional.
Yeah.
And I think we need to watch that we make the exceptional as a kind of measure for the average, and especially in self-defense. That's a big flaw. So we look at MMA now. Also in the Netherlands, that there is this guy. He does MMA, and he teaches. Or he says he is teaching special forces. And I think, but if you teach that to a guy fully equipped with all his gear on, he's not able to fight like that. And that's again the context. They only look at what they are able to do, and they think you have to do that because it works for me. But that doesn't mean that it works for someone else.
Yeah. So hopefully all the names we're dropping won't be too confusing to the audience. But what popped into my head was Raymond Daniels. Raymond Daniels is a karate-based, extremely acrobatic kickboxer. He's famous for doing 2-touch knockouts. So he'll do like a jumping side kick and then tap you with the side kick and then do a spin and hit you with the wheel
back kick. Yeah.
and knock you out with the wheel kick.
Yeah.
You don't really want him teaching that skill to people who are going to have to be wearing, 60 pounds of gear in a fight. That's
for example,
he did a 720. Like he went up and did 2 full twists.
Yeah.
Like faked a kick, landed and knocked the guy out with a cross.
Yeah. It's from a movement perspective, it's incredible, but from a special forces, but also a girl of 50 kilogram who needs to fight off a guy of 100. If you put a thumb in one's eye, you don't need a 720 spinning kick. You only need to do. It's one of my teachers in the early days. He is still rather criminal. And he always said, Jan, if you want to train to look beautiful, continue. He said, if you want to train to defend yourself, you only need a couple of things. He said, you need a good block to protect your head, because if someone is really aggressive, they always go for the head.
Yeah.
But that's one. He said, you need a good fist. That's 2. He said, but most important, you need the mentality to land that fist on the nose of someone else. He said, if you have that 3, you don't need anything else.
Yeah.
And that reality, I think that's also why a lot of people are involved in martial arts, which say they have something to do with fighting, but they actually turn around fighting, real fighting. And so people don't want the reality of a real fight, but they want the fantasy of the illusion. And I think that's one of the biggest flaw. I love martial arts. I really love I almost practiced every martial arts there is, and I really love it. Still, I love it. But the biggest flaw is that they create illusions when it comes to your effectiveness in a real fight.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever seen this? There's this comic. It's 2 people sitting at a desk, or like maybe it's a door that people are lining up for. And the one desk says, harsh truths, and the other desk says comforting lies.
Yeah.
A huge line for comforting lies.
Yeah.
No line for harsh truths. And this is like, are you familiar with Steve Morris?
No.
Steve Morris is he would probably reject the term self-defense and martial arts. Thinks that both worlds are completely filled with charlatans. Well, let's call him an expert on violence, right?
Okay.
Is a quite interesting character from the UK.
Steve Morris or Lee Morrison?
Steve Morris.
No. Lee Morrison, I know, because it's more or less the same kind of figure then.
Yeah, I mean, but so one of the things Steve advocates is army milling, right? So when you start training, you should, fairly soon, you get 20-ounce gloves, you get headgear, you get a mouthpiece, and for 1 minute, you have 2 guys go at it as hard as they can. All right, 100%. Can't move back. Not a sparring situation where you're darting in trying to get points. Just like 100%.
Yeah.
And his thing is, if you don't have the will to fight, like it doesn't matter what techniques you have. You have to build the will first. You have to recognize where the will is.
Yeah.
Then you can build up from there. But he'll tell you that, like, when he installed things like this in his program, his student base went from 200 to 30.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
This is a problem for anybody in the martial arts community. The reality of what you're trying to teach is not very marketable, right? The other aspect that, I've come to through many years of martial arts practice is, I'm very vulnerable and everybody's very vulnerable.
Yeah.
No amount of physical training of combative skills will make me particularly, will honestly give me that much more advantage than I already had, being naturally sort of big, powerful, athletic guy who also has a calm temperament. Right?
Yeah.
Like, those are big advantages already.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, like I came back to jiu-jitsu after sort of 9 years out of jiu-jitsu, and, still have my white belt, went in and just was bigger and more athletic than everybody in the gym. And that, a relative modicum of training, just knowing where people are going to try to attack me, allowed me to run through everybody on the first round. What's interesting is that second, third, fourth round through the gym, people start recognizing your strengths. But it's amazing that just the athleticism, on a first encounter can be overwhelming.
Well, it exactly this, what you say now, is one of the reasons that I introduced to the Dutch martial arts community a different approach to basic training. Because most of the time, basic training, for example, in karate, is you start with kyuan, so you start with a punching, you start with a stance, you start with a kicking. But we see, especially nowadays, with all the children sitting behind their games and stuff like that, there is a real reduction of really basic stuff like coordination, flexibility, and stuff like that. So I said, maybe we have to redefine basic training in martial arts. Maybe we have to develop this basic athletic skills first before you teach them a technique, because some children don't even know what left and right is. and they are not 3, they are 12, they are 13. Mm-hmm. So that's a big challenge. So if you stay with the idea that basic training is teaching someone punching and kicking, then you miss something. And I see that what you described just, your experience, I see it all of the time, that the more, I think Emily Conrad once called it the kinesthetically gifted people. Mm-hmm. You see it directly, and they don't know how to do a triangle choke or how to do the guard or stuff like that. But somehow they have this movement intelligence, which enables them to stay out of the claws of someone with a blue belt, for example, in BJJ. And I think, okay, if that's true, so some people have it, well, it may be God given or nature gives it to you, but you can learn it. It's teachable. Yeah. And maybe not until the same level as the natural talent has, but you can teach it. And maybe it's your responsibility as a teacher to first spend some time to help your students to develop this general athletic abilities before you actually throw them into the sea of technique.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the idea of natural movement. This is I was talking to Katie Bowman recently. She was talking about this idea that, like, if you raise a tree in a greenhouse, it won't thrive. Actually, it won't grow as well as if you get it outside. But also, once you take it outside, it's very likely to get injured because you've removed the wind, right? Mm-hmm. And the rain. And those are the things that cause the tissues to grow strong in a tree. Mm-hmm. So before you can take a tree outside, you have to harden it off. You have to start slowly exposing it to the outdoor elements. And what we have is a population that is like trees that have been raised in greenhouses. We are a sedentary population.
Yeah.
And we are, people talk a lot about the obesity epidemic, which is one aspect of sedentism. And I also think, the industrial food system and, hormonal, hormonal issues and, environmental toxins, there's a lot of elements to that. But I think that people don't recognize that there's an epidemic of weakness, of physical atrophy of the musculature system. And and poor coordination, like basic stuff. I haven't found a scholarly resource on this, but I've heard a number of teachers talking about this idea that it's becoming less and less common to find kids who can skip. It's a basic coordinative pattern that pretty much all children develop, and it's becoming less and less common to see that when they come into PE, they can just skip.
Yeah.
So people don't have the coordinative resources to try to do a lot of the things that we would traditionally ask of them. And I'm skeptical of the claim that the traditional martial arts are as traditional as they're made out to be.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the kata, I think there's a lot of myth around kata, and a lot of it is less relevant. I don't think it's highly relevant to fighting ability. I think that kata, my guess, and this is something that's influenced by my friend Scott Park Phillips, is that kata is associated with the Chinese martial arts and their derivatives. The forms are associated with that because of their interrelationship with theater. That martial arts were very closely related to theater and religious practice. And that's how these forms became codified as part of the practice. I don't think they have a lot of a fundamental transfer, right? But
no, there is his historian. He says forms and kata are a part of the mindfuck of martial arts. So if you are able to show an impressive form, most people think you're a very good fighter. And that's already part of the magic.
I watched The Matrix recently.
Yeah.
And they're like doing all this wushu, like, they separate and they do these, I'm like, what the hell? Like, what are you doing? Right.
Yeah.
And then they throw all these strikes that are, out of measure, completely, ridiculous. And this is what we saw, right? But this is probably part of Chinese theater for thousands of years, right? Or
it can be. And it's a proven fact. Harry Cook, it's a karate historian. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he did a research. He actually received death threats because of the book, because he showed, he really proved that kata and Shotokan were, after World War II, most of the Japanese students were or dead or that traumatized that they forgot how the kata were be done. And so they, it was a bit like this and a bit like this. So in fact, after World War II, there is a kind of black box. So and that's what kata is nowadays for most of the Japanese.
Yeah. So I think that fundamentally martial arts all over the world were largely taught in a way that was probably more congruent with like a constraints-led approach now or nonlinear pedagogy prior to relatively recently. Not as sophisticated as that, not as tightly maybe constrained and like designed as people can now, knowing what we know about it. But basically, I think that you would play the game, whatever set of games that were involved in the type of combat that you did. Wrestling is something you see in every culture in the world, some sort of boxing games. You'd maybe have some more limited versions for a safety version, right? You'd spar with swords and weapons using blunted weapons or padded weapons. And then you'd practice techniques, right? And those are the two main aspects of it, right? And I think that there was something that happened in the Asian martial arts. This is my guess, is that you had the forms, which were really part of its connection to the religious and theatrical aspect of martial arts, which were passed down through these lineages. And then when the Western perspective on scientific methodology and treating everything basically as an engineering practice was kind of installed in the East, that's where we got this everybody in straight lines, which is also a great way to be able to teach a lot of students at once.
Yeah.
And to me, it looks a lot like Swedish gymnastics, right? It's basically where I think a lot of it comes from. It's factory-based movement.
Yeah, and it helps to brainwash Military, yeah. Well, that's actually one of the hypotheses why everyone needs to do the same at the same time when someone shouts at you.
Yeah.
It's in fact military didactics.
Yeah.
But I think something comes to my mind now, that something you said before about the movement culture, the obese pandemic, and stuff like that. I think what a lot of people also think nowadays is, I just this weekend I had a discussion, this past weekend discussion with someone. He promoted, if you train twice a week, then you lose fat. And I said, and then I started a discussion with him and said, so you give them vitamin M. Mm-hmm. He said, what do you mean with it? I said, well, you offer them a supplement. He said, it's the same like you eat McDonald's Happy Meals every day, and twice a week you go to a pharmacy, you buy a multivitamin, and you think you become healthy with that. And you offer them twice a week 1 hour of physical training, and you think that's enough to counter a sedentary lifestyle. So isn't it your responsibility as a kinesthetically gifted human being that you help other people to integrate more movement into daily life, instead of sitting on a couch watching Netflix, to get off this couch, walking with a dog every day, instead of thinking that a kind of excuse training twice a week will counter all the hours sitting on a couch. And I think that's a big flaw I see nowadays in a lot of, if it's yoga, Pilates, I don't know. They create this thing that if you do this, then it's good for you, but they don't make a transfer. They don't help people to transfer what they learn in this dojo or yoga studio to daily life.
Yeah,
I think that's the biggest job movement teachers have, is not only to promote their 2 hours a week and their own most sophisticated methods. No, I think what can you do to help your student to integrate it in life so movement becomes more natural to them?
Yeah, I mean, speaking my language, I think actually Katie Bowman has gone deeper on this than anything else. She calls her stuff nutritious movement, right? And the idea is that we need to. Well, one way that I described it when I spoke with her was that we can think of a movement culture, right? Or movement cultures, which is sort of like the elements of our culture that are very specifically about movement, right? So parkour is like a movement culture, right? It's like, it's a cultural thing that you do and that is oriented towards getting movement done.
Yeah.
And so we can add more of these things. We can have more movement culture. But we can also look to have more movement within culture, right? So gardening, gathering, hunting, like these are things that the output is not the movement, but movement is required to achieve the output. This is a lot of what Katie is advocating is like, how do you shift the sort of the strategies around how you educate your children, around how you feed yourself, around how you do all these things so that you're harvesting more movement all the time. Yeah. And so within Evolve Move Play, we talk about this as a movement practice versus a movement lifestyle. We want people to establish a movement lifestyle as a first thing, right? Along with the movement practice. The practice helps anchor everything, right? But ultimately, you can only achieve so much in even an hour a day when the other 23 hours a day look like a standard, Western lifestyle.
In those other hours, we pay other people to move for us, to clean the garden and to cook and stuff like that. Yeah.
So like I'm trying, in my own life, I think about trying to adopt the mindset that, when I'm doing the dishes or when I'm sweeping or when I'm vacuuming, that I'm actually harvesting movement, right? And small things like getting rid of my automatic coffee grinder and replacing it with a hand crank coffee grinder, right? All these little things to get more movement in. The research on this is really interesting because just from a purely like body composition standpoint. If you work out hard for an hour, you might burn 300 calories, right? If you have higher non-exercise physical activity throughout the day, you can burn 1,400 more calories a day.
Yeah.
So the impact of your non-exercise physical activity on your health is often superior to anything you can achieve in a normal exercise system. And I like to do things where I, go into a canyon and climb down the canyon in cold water for 8 hours. That's going to burn a lot of calories.
It sure does. It sure does.
That's not most people's normal experience of exercise.
No, and even that, in the Netherlands, we had this discussion a lot. Most of the time I tried to keep my mouth shut, but on a moment I thought, no. The thing was that a lot of good movers started to promote themselves as, how you call it, the measure for good movement. If you were not able to stand on your hands for 1 minute, you're a loser. If you're not able to touch your toes with stretched legs, you're a loser. But then I think, now I'm a man. I'm sitting on the couch watching Netflix, and in my other hand I have my phone, and then I see at Instagram, I see a promotion of a guy like that. I say, standing on my, it's already difficult for me to get out of this couch. And so the distance between getting out of this couch and standing for 1 minute on your hands is huge.
Yeah.
And then I say, okay, but just the fact that you're able to do it, the fact that you're able to do it. I love Dylan Werner, for example, this yoga guy who is able to do the most crazy things on his hands. I find it wonderful, but is it good movement just because he's able to do it? I can also eat 20 hamburgers a day, maybe, but is it good?
Yeah.
And I think we need to Alexander, of the Alexander technique.
Yeah.
He made a distinction between use and function. So function is more what nature gives you, like abilities, your physiology, your anatomy, and stuff like this. So does your system function well? But use is more a responsibility thing, a choice thing. What are you doing with it? And I think what you just told about how you address movement within your system is also addressing this use part. So you can go totally into function, but that doesn't mean that someone sitting in the couch is motivated to do it. You need to address something. You need to touch them on their responsibility and their freedom maybe even more, that they have the power to make a choice. To get out of this couch.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is essentially the same thing we're seeing in the martial arts, right? But blown up in scope, right?
Yeah.
So take a wushu world champion.
Yeah.
Right? The way they move is going to impress anybody, right? This is somebody who can flip and spin and bounce incredibly high in the air, right?
It is, yeah.
Super flexible, can put their toes on their forehead. And then take, Roy Nelson or Derek Lewis, I guess is a good example. Fat guy, probably gets tired walking upstairs. Not super flexible, moves really funky. But who do you want with you in a dark alley if you get attacked by a mugger?
Yeah.
You want Derek Lewis.
Yeah.
Derek Lewis has lightning in his right hand.
Yeah.
Knows how to fight and is willing to fight. Right.
Yeah.
And has the mentality where there's this funny meme about Derek Lewis and how he doesn't have traditionally good jiu-jitsu. And he keeps getting in jiu-jitsu situations and he just sort of shrugs it off. Right.
Okay.
If grappler takes you down, just say no. If grappler tries to submit you, just say no. Right.
Yeah.
But you have to have a certain mentality and a certain physical robustness to achieve that. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily look like super aesthetic.
No.
People mistake the aesthetics for their reality. And it's the same thing.
Exactly. And I think this is a very important message. Just because it looks good, it doesn't mean it is good. And it is not the measure for good movement.
Yeah.
It depends on a lot of things.
So, the guy who kind of started the current idea of movement culture is, of course, Judo Portal. And he put out this video, which has, maybe 1 million views or something right now, of him doing capoeira skills, but without the game, right? At a very high level, mixed with, really high level gymnastic strength. All right, so he took the floreo skills of capoeira and he hybridized them with gymnastic strength and called it self-dominance. And then everyone wants to follow in the footsteps of this idea of self-dominance. Any idea that I can think of how my body can move, I want to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. So I started to think that you can look at freedom within your body internally, right? The body and the relationship to itself, or externally. What can the body achieve in the world outside of itself? And I have a friend who's a parkour athlete who, like me, is also a martial artist. He also studied dance. And he's not particularly strong, and he's not very flexible, right? But he can run away from the police really well.
It's also important.
Right? He can fight and he can dance and charm women by dancing. It's like, well, really, which is more important, right? Which skill set would you like, right?
Yeah.
To me, the way that my body can solve problems in the environment is much more important. And
exactly.
We see this also, like, I think it's funny. I think a lot of people within kind of the movement space are pretty negative towards team sports, because a lot of them are talented athletes who are small, and team sports have a real bias towards physical size, right? If you don't have the gift of size, it can be quite punishing, even if you're a really talented athlete. So you go and you find something like gymnastics or parkour or movement culture, and it's like, oh, well, now I'm really rewarded for it, but I still have this resentment toward team sport. That's my speculative psychology of it. But I've noticed this trend, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that there's actually so much that's interesting about martial arts. I think that like rugby or football are really fantastic self-defense. Like, people don't think about it's always like mano a mano in a dark alley. It's like, what if like your self-defense is like, there's a terrorist attack and you're in a crowd of 400 people trying to escape from a square where somebody's spraying a gun, right? Being able to gouge someone's eyes out is not necessarily what you need, but being able to stay balanced while people bounce into you and to run fast and see gaps opening and closing, well, that's really valuable. Well, who has that? Football players, right? Rugby players. Being able to tackle somebody, being able to coordinate and communicate effectively with other people. Like, there's a reason these sports exist.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you look at it, you see some of the best movement problem solvers are, maybe a little bit chubby, maybe a little bit inflexible, right? But they're attuned to what their body allows. And they're strong.
Yeah. And I think there, as a culture, we make a big mistake. I don't know how it's in the United States, but here in Europe, all schools need to invest in what we call 21st century skills.
Okay.
But if you look at the educational program, it's all about how to use computers, how to do this, how to do that. So I was in a board of a local educational foundation. And I said, but just imagine, look at how our climate is changing. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine that nature at one point is saying, human, you fucked up. I take charge now. And you can only use your iPad to cut vegetables because there is no electricity, there is no Wi-Fi, there is nothing. How do we prepare children for that? Yeah, but no, they need to learn how to deal with computers. They already know that. But they don't know, if there is no electricity or whatever, how to deal with themselves. And isn't it time? I come to it because you say it needs to be about the ability to solve problems.
Yes.
And children are just not able to do that anymore. They don't have the abilities anymore, but they are also not taught anymore how to do it.
Yeah. I mean, this is really at the heart of what I'm doing with Evolve Move Play, right? Mm. My mentor and friend, John Bloem, he talks about this idea of we need to evolve evolvability, right?
Yeah.
So if you're trying to teach, the problem we have is that the culture is changing. The technological environment is changing faster than it ever has. So if you're trying to future-proof your children and you're teaching them the latest iteration of technology, it's going to be irrelevant, right? Nobody types on a typewriter anymore.
No.
Like the type of typewriter we use now may be completely irrelevant in 10 years, right? Everybody's going to be using a handheld device, and maybe QWERTY is going to go away, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why not, right? Like if everyone's using their thumbs, or maybe we're using the like cursive.
Yeah, you press with this and you swipe with this one. Yeah.
It could change completely, right? Or maybe it's also going to be voice capture, right? Like voice messaging. Who knows? So what you should ask yourself is like, okay, if I had been educated in 1950 or 1980 or 1880, which would have been the skills that would have held me well in all of those environments?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And then you say, well, a child who has those is going to be able to adapt to the new things. And I think play is actually the most, are you familiar with Nassim Taleb's idea of Lindy?
No.
It's a really cool idea. So Lindy is basically the observation that cultural artifacts, their longevity is predicted by how old they already are. So the living thing, the older it is, the shorter its projected lifespan is. But with a cultural artifact or institution, the older it is, the longer you expect it to stay around.
Okay, so it's not I'm the best because I'm the oldest, but I'm the oldest because I'm the best.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So there are many, like there was thousands of classical composers, right? And there's not that many who we currently know, right?
No.
And maybe some of them were great, and some of the ones that we have now aren't the best. But nevertheless, like Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, right? They've been around for a long time. So if you ask like 100 years from now, are we more likely to still be listening to Bach or the Backstreet Boys, or I guess that's an old reference, I should say, Cardi B, right? Yeah. Probably Bach. Right.
I know who the Backstreet Boys are, but the latter I don't know.
Okay. You don't want to know. What are we going to be reading 100 years from now? The Bible or Twilight?
Mm-hmm.
Right, we're going to.
But don't you think that attribution also impacts this process a lot? There is this experiment. I don't know the name, but he was in the 90s or something. He was one of the most famous violin players in the world, and they put him in a metro station in New York. They put him clothes on in such a way that he looked like a clochard, a drifter, and they made him play one of Bach's most difficult violin pieces. No one even paid notice to this guy. Mm-hmm. And normally, if he comes to Amsterdam in the concert, we call it the Concertgebouw. He's one of the most beautiful and best concert places in Europe. You need to pay 150 euros to come even in. And here he was at a metro station in New York, and no one even noticed. And that's what they call this attribution stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're just looking at two different phenomena, right? Like that's still who's popular within a specific cultural clique right now.
Yeah,
right. That's not what has. He's not 500 years old, right? His art hasn't been proved over 500 years or 1,000 years.
No, but I mean with that, if Bach was this violin player and he was promoted by a specific part of culture who had a lot of power, and other people took it over and over and over, generation by generation, then the attribution is at the cause of it. And maybe someone who was much better than him,
sure,
who was in this in this metro station in New York. No one knows of him.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect process, right?
No.
But the idea is that things that have survived a long time have shown that they're resilient.
That's for sure.
Right. And unlike, living organisms generally have an obsolescence cycle, right? We have telomeres that get short with age, the biological function breaks, right? If we didn't have that, then in some sense you'd see the same thing, right? If there was nothing that killed you except for like disease and other people, then the older someone is, that would be an indication that they were more resistant to disease and more resistant to other people, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing with cultural artifacts. They don't have any specifically specified lifespan based on like biological processes. So the older they are, the more resilient they are to the problems. Now, one thing that does happen, and this is an interesting thing, is that the contributions of many people tend to be accreted to a single individual over time, right? As our memory collapses. So I'm sure that, like, Systema, right? How many people really contributed to the development of it, right? And then who has gathered the lion's share of the awareness?
Yeah.
Like 50 years from now, will anyone remember any of the names other than the absolute specialists, other than Ryabko and Vasiliev? Probably not. Not because their contribution was outsized compared to everyone else. They just got a sort of runaway feedback loop, and everybody else's contributions start becoming attributed to them. Yeah. So I think that's true. But this isn't so much about who deserves credit for a cultural innovation as just the idea that a cultural innovation that has been around for a long time is likely to be sustained for a long time. So that's the idea of Lindy. Well, I think that play is the most Lindy educational system.
Yep.
Right. Play is essentially evolution's designed for the type of education that a human being that has served human beings well over a very long time. It doesn't mean that it's flawless, right? Like, I think that video games are a really powerful system for hijacking the play subsystem and outputting something that has very low utility in human life.
Yeah.
But I just think it's an interesting place to study and a guide and a motivational tool set that we can use to actually get people to cultivate skills that have fundamental relevance in environments, even as they're rapidly changing.
There is this professor here in the Netherlands. He just wrote 2 years ago an article in which he stated that the reason why that many children have psychopathology like ADHD or autism or stuff like is due to the fact that they don't play anymore.
Yeah. Because
he said in play, when children play, and play means not playing games, but really play, just like children do. They gather and there's something happening. I still remember when I was a lecturer at the Academy of Physical Education, I once said to my students, I said, instead of organizing a sports lesson, just try to keep it safe, but let children do whatever they do. Because what concerns me a bit is after a sports lesson at school, children need to take a shower, but they don't sweat. But when they go outside for 15 minutes at the schoolyard, they sweat, they like that. So something in the difference between game, which for me means it is organized by an adult, and so children have to do what the adult thinks is right for them, and play is just what children do. That's somehow much more exciting, much more challenging for children, and I think it offers them an ability to because they have to deal with each other. So there are social abilities which they develop in it, the physical stuff connected to it. But children are somehow able to create this for themselves. Mm-hmm. So the only thing we have to do as adults is to create the possibilities for them to do. And if I look here at the village I'm living, but where do children need to do it? It are all houses, cars. Where a tree? You know, if you just yesterday I came to my practice here, and there was a young boy there standing under the tree, and his whole body showed, I'm going to climb this tree. Then his mother came. They lived just across the street. His mother came out of the house yelling, "Stop! That's dangerous!" And he was completely confused. Like, what's dangerous? You know, I just want to climb the tree. The mother is not explaining what's dangerous. So parents create if I generalize it, parents seem to create a fear for moving, for taking challenges. And so children, they look at trees now as something which is dangerous because he might be able to fall from it.
Yeah. Well, everything is dangerous to a generation that's been taught, you know, that's never been allowed to embody courage.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the theses of Jonathan Haidt's and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling the American Mind, right? Yeah. People have become hypersensitive to threat because they weren't allowed to go through the normal process of exposing themselves to physical, emotional, and social danger, which is part of a normal childhood, but that we have destroyed through helicopter parenting. And this is just a general trend in the Western world of safetyism above everything, which is absolutely destructive. That's another reason why we need to advocate for play. You know, people think that, you know, I hear a lot of people say that people choose not to move because, you know, we're evolutionarily designed to be energy efficient. Mm-hmm. I think that's incorrect, right? I think that that we are conditioning our children to be afraid of movement.
It's more easy if I look at teachers at secondary school or even primary school. I think you call it in the States like that. They have something to gain when all children are sitting quietly, because in the Netherlands we have 30 kids in a classroom, mm-hmm. and it's rather chaotic if they all do their own thing. So they try to emphasize also the non-movement into children, just because it's more easy for them. In the Netherlands, most parents need 2 jobs. They each need a job to pay their mortgage and stuff like that. So it's very convenient.
Actually, it's much worse here than in the Netherlands. Netherlands has a much higher percentage of part-time working mothers, whereas most mothers have to work full-time here in the United States.
But just imagine what the impact on children. So as parents, a moving child is difficult. In my practice, a lot of children are referred to me because they have ADHD or whatever. Yeah, they like to move.
Exactly. I think
but they are not allowed to move. Yeah, and then they become difficult because they want to move. Yeah. And then we call it ADHD.
Yeah, I mean, I am diagnosed with ADHD. Most of the leaders in the parkour community have ADHD diagnosis background. Yeah. Like, I think I don't, you know, when you start digging into how disorders are diagnosed and recognized in psychology and psychiatry, turns out that it's a dirty game. It's very poorly understood scientifically. But I think that it's likely that there's a number of different things that are being lumped into that ADHD diagnosis, and with multiple causes. But I think one of the largest ones is just that children have a variable desire for movement, and that children who are highly motivated to move are going to suffer in our current sedentary culture, and so they come across as having dysfunction because their needs are not being met. And there's research that shows this, right? There's a certain way that they've studied ADHD type brains in rats, where they induce I think it's something like the frontal cortex has a thinner membrane, something like that, in people with ADHD. Don't quote me on this, but there's something to do with that you see in juvenile animals that are juvenile humans that are diagnosed with ADHD. And we can cause this in rats, and what we find is that rats that have this condition have a desire for rough and tumble play in particular that's heightened, and they will engage in far more rough and tumble behavior. And if they just allow the rat to meet its normal desire, its intrinsic desire for rough and tumble play, then its brain will develop normally, and it will have the same type of adult brain as the rest of the rats.
Yeah, but it's even proven already in children, because the area, the prefrontal part, that's the part of the executive functions, so controlling your emotions, organizing yourself. But you need play for that.
Yeah.
Because in play, you need to organize yourself. If you have pain, but you still are involved in the game, you need to deal with it. You need to organize it. And it's already shown that especially play. So if you are you probably know it better than me because you do it a lot of times. But if you want to climb a tree, every step, especially when you are at a certain height, every step you make, you need to think of in front, can I do it? Or do I need to take a different track now? That's executive function. But if you disable children to do this kind of stuff, of course your brain is not developing then.
Yeah, you can't. The idea that the brain can be isolated from the body and its interaction with the environment is false. And
it is.
We don't. We have. I think of our culture as basically a bunch of kludges, right? Are you familiar with the term kludge?
No, but.
So a kludge is essentially when you're doing software engineering and you discover a problem, and you don't have time to go back to the base code and rewrite it so the problem isn't there, and you just put some quick and dirty solution on top of it. You basically throw some tape on it, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of times what happens with the kludge is that it then sets up future problems because it's a bad solution. You use a bad solution because you don't have time to find an elegant solution. But then that bad solution has costs that you then have to continue doing. So when you're doing a software development cycle, if you're forced to fix the software too fast, then you end up with all these problems. I think that's essentially what's happening with our culture, is that we're having to adapt to changing technological circumstances too fast. And so everybody now works outside of the home. So we need to shove kids into schools, which are basically just prisons for children. Right. And then the teachers need to be able to control the behavior of the children. And then we have something like No Child Left Behind, which makes everybody supposed to achieve these standards on standardized tests that are not feasible. And so now they're everything that's not academic is being pushed to the side, essentially completely ignoring the normal process of child development and why that might be important for functional human adults. And it's like, no
and
child.
If they dysfunction, we send them to a martial arts school to re-educate them. And the parents go to the Wim Hof method and bathing in ice, and they think that's helpful then also. But how did you call it? Smooth?
Kludge. It's Kludge. A kludge.
I think there are a lot of kludgy methods out there. Just recently, I had a talk with a very famous guy. He's a TV presenter here in the Netherlands, and he promotes himself as the fitness guru of the world. And he had this talk with Wim Hof. And from that moment on, he promoted that ice bathing. So all the well-known Dutch TV persons, celebrities, they are encouraged to bathe every morning into ice. And he said, yeah, that helps to reduce stress. And I said, no, it doesn't help to reduce stress. It's but scientifically, but the Wim Hof method is a bit more than only bathing in ice. He said, but if you look at stress is nothing. Stress is neutral. Stress is that what your body is doing to help you to deal with a challenge. It's not negative or positive. He said, but this stress, the negative stress, is more or less connected with a kind of powerlessness. And now imagine that you see this bath filled with ice cubes, and you think, I'm not able to do this. And 2 minutes later, you step out of the bath and you actually did it.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the real effect, not the bath, but the fact that you give yourself the message, I thought I was not able to do it, and I did it anyway. But then the bath is not the thing. The ice is not the thing. Maybe going with you in this canoeing stuff has the same effect, because people say,
it's
I need to jump this waterfall.
That you can acute stresses that you can positively change. It's like why we like to watch tragic movies too, right?
Yeah.
Because you can experience this intense emotion and then be able to have it resolved and let it go.
Yeah.
And that can be healing, that can be inoculating for the reality of future traumas. There's a reason why I approach but I mean, there is evidence on like heat shock proteins from saunas and how those impact, growth hormone and stuff. So I wouldn't say that we necessarily know there's not other things going on, but certainly, one of the fundamentals of any physical practice is this ability to choose to take on a problem that creates a stress response that can be positively resolved in a reasonable frame, right?
Yeah.
The problem that we have with a lot of our work stress and other stress like that is that it's chronic, right? And that's relatively atypical from an evolutionary perspective. So I have to go. I'm going to go get a massage.
Oh yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Have an acute stressor that will then be resolved, and then my body will feel better.
Exactly.
So Jan, any last words, anything people should know as far as working with you or where you're at online, how to follow up on your ideas?
Yeah, well, I think I'm on social media. I'm not that's the reason why Tom Campbell probably gave you this idea to invite me over, because I'm not one promoting myself pretty much. Yeah. But if people type my name, they will find me.
Okay, sounds good. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me over.
Yeah, it was a very fun conversation. I look forward to future chats.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hey, you've reached the end of another Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you want to be involved in the conversation, please consider joining us in our new membership subscription so you can get access to question and answers with our live speakers once a month, question and answers with me once a month, and a dedicated forum to discuss everything going on in the podcast, as well as a general discussion of movement on our general movement forums. If you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link below, get signed up, and join a part of our membership community. If you can't join our membership community right now, it's still always helpful if you can like, share, and subscribe, and even hit that bell and get notifications for upcoming Evolve, Move, Play podcasts. But adios for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.